I'm going to show you how to deploy the vRO appliance. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
As you can see, what we're going to be doing in this video is deploying the vRO server. Now, to remind you, we're in the middle of a series of 3 videos. In the previous video, we began the process of setting up our Orchestrator server, specifically a standalone Orchestrator server. So, step number 1, download the OVA file. We've done that. Excellent. So here we are in step number 2, where what we're going to be doing in this video is deploying the vRO virtual appliance, which contains the vRO server. We're going to deploy that vRO appliance from the OVA file that we just downloaded. And we're going to do that in the lab environment. So let's head to the lab environment. As you can see, we're right where we left off in the previous video. We went to my.vmware.com and we downloaded version 8.2 of the Orchestrator server software. Now that we've got that OVA file, what we're going to do is open up another tab. And in this tab, I'm going to use this URL to point to my vCenter server so that I can log in using the vSphere client. Now, here's the vSphere client. It's asking me to authenticate, so let me do that real quickly here. I'll click Login. And as you can see, it's now logging me into the vSphere client. Well, what we're going to do next is to deploy the Orchestrator virtual appliance from the OVA file that we just downloaded. And we can do that in different ways. We could do that from the hosts and clusters view, or I'm going to choose to do it from the VMs and templates view. You could do it from either. But I'm going to kick off the installation process by right-clicking. In my case, I'm going to right-click this data center. You might right-click elsewhere, but data center is a valid choice. We're going to choose Deploy OVF Template. Now, that's slightly different than what we've talked about. We've been talking about an OVA file. OVF and OVA are very closely related formats. Let's not worry about the differences there. So pretend, if you would, with me that this says Deploy OVA Template. So we'll choose that. And now we just need to start answering some questions. As you can see, it's going to take us through these 6 different steps. Let's see what they are. So the first question is, where is that OVA? I know it says OVF, but where's that OVA file? Well, you may have that OVA file on some web server somewhere, in which case you can give a URL to point to it. But as you saw in the previous video, we downloaded a local copy of that file. So we're going to choose Local File. We'll click on Upload Files. And then we're just going to go to wherever we put the OVA file, which you'll recall we put into the Downloads folder. Here it is. I'll select it. I'll click Open. And now the vSphere client knows where the installation OVA file is. So we'll click Next. The next thing it wants to know is the name of the vRO appliance. Now, this is not the host name of the Orchestrator server, but rather this is the name that's going to show up in the vSphere client. It's the display name of the machine. I'm going to choose to call my machine SA, which in my environment, our naming scheme is SA, stands for Site A, as opposed to Site B. So we're deploying this into Site A. It's an Orchestrator server, so I'll say vRO. It's our first one, and that's the name I'm going to use. I'm copying that into my buffer because that name's going to come up again in a slightly different way here in a few moments. The display name is going to be SA-VRO-01. Next, we need to pick which of these VM folders we want the appliance deployed into. I could put it into this one here called Discovered Virtual Machines, or this one here called Templates. Well, that would make sense. This is going to be an appliance, not a template, so I'm not going to put it there. But rather, I'm going to put it here into Lab VMs. So if I drill down here, I can choose Lab VMs or another folder. Or if you choose SA Data Center, it will still build the virtual appliance. It just will build that appliance in the data center without putting it into a VM folder. So totally up to you. I'm going to choose Lab VMs. which means that the VM is going to land in this folder here, along with these other two appliances I have running. Let's click Next. We continue through our 6-step process here. The next thing it wants to know is, where do you want to run the Orchestrator server? Now, if you, in your environment, have a compute cluster where the user's machines run, and a management cluster where things like vCenter and ESXi and vRA and other management components reside, if you have that sort of split, then obviously you're going to put Orchestrator into the management cluster. Now, you don't have to have a management cluster, but for all the usual design reasons, we've got one here in this environment. So I'm going to choose this cluster. Notice, if you will, I could have picked a specific host, but I'm going to choose the cluster itself, thereby allowing vSphere to pick which host to run it on. And from then on out, once the vRO appliance is actually up and running, since this management cluster is a fully automated DRS cluster, the Orchestrator appliance is going to be getting migrated around amongst these 4 different ESXi hosts anyway. So I'm just going to take the easy way out. I'll choose SA management and allow vSphere to pick which of those 4 hosts to initially start running the vRO appliance upon. We'll click Next. Here in step 4, it's giving us a quick reminder of the questions that we've answered so far. And I'll let you hit pause if you want to read through these, but there's one in particular I want to point out to you, which is that we're going to be asked about how we want to deploy the disk or disks used by this appliance. And it's telling us here, we haven't made the decision yet, but it's telling us here that there's going to be a significant impact depending upon whether we choose thin provisioned or thick provisioned. But we're not there yet. So just think of this as a little reminder. But we're going to continue onwards. Interesting. Some additional steps have been added. We had 6 steps before, but some more have been added. So here in step 4, we can review the details, but we need to continue forward. So we'll click Next. And as you can see, it takes us to the terribly exciting legalese here on the license agreement screen. I'll spare you. I'm just going to accept the license and continue forward. In step 6, it's asking us, where do we want the vRO appliance to be deployed in terms of what data store? And additionally, it's asking us that question I mentioned a few moments ago. Here we need to choose whether we want to use one of the 2 different thick provisioning types or thin provision. Now, I'm not going to go into a full spiel on the difference between thick versus thin, but suffice it to say that, as we saw 2 screens ago, there is a big difference in terms of the amount of disk space that will be initially consumed depending upon whether you choose thin or thick. If you choose either of these 2 thick options, we are going to pre-allocate all of the disk space that the Orchestrator server is configured to have. On the other hand, I'm going to choose thin provision so that it will provision just enough initially. I think it said in 2 screens ago, 6 gigabytes. And any additional disk space that's going to be needed from there on out will be added automatically by vSphere on the fly. Again, that's not a full discussion of thick versus thin, but that's why I'm choosing thin. I'm choosing thin because I have a smaller lab environment and I'm trying to conserve disk space. So we're going to use thin provisioning, and as you can see, I have 3 different data stores, and I'm going to choose the first data store simply because it's the one that has the most space. If you want to, you can use data store clusters and other vSphere techniques like that, but if you're just trying to do a simple deployment, pick your data store and click Next. On this step here, we're being asked to pick which network the vRO virtual appliance is going to be plugged into. And typically that is going to be your management network, the same network that your vCenter server is plugged into, your ESXi hosts, and so forth. As you can see, I have a number of other networks, but management is where I want my Orchestrator server plugged in so that it's able to talk directly to things such as the vCenter server. As you can see here, it starts talking a bit about IP addressing. It says here that by default, we're going to use statically assigned IP addresses. In fact, that's what I'm going to do, but I'll show you in a few moments how you could choose dynamic DHCP instead. So we'll carry on by clicking Next. And now we get to a screen. This is the first screen in this deployment from an OVA wizard where things are going to potentially look different from other appliances that you deploy. So this screen here is all the questions that are specific to Orchestrator. First thing it wants to know is what is the host name that you want to assign to the Orchestrator server? Not the display name, but the host name. Well, as I said before, the display name is SA-VRO-01, but I'm going to actually use a fully qualified domain name. And notice that the text here says it instructs you to use a fully qualified domain name. I'm using a fully qualified domain name here because right before I created this video, as I was practicing the steps to do this again, I failed to use an FQDN, and that caused me problems. My Orchestrator server would work, but it wouldn't work if I attempted to connect to it using the FQDN. So put an FQDN here, and then later on when you start connecting to Orchestrator, you're going to need to use that same FQDN in the URL that you use to connect to Orchestrator. So use an FQDN. Learn from my painful experience. Next up, it wants to know the password for the root account. That Orchestrator virtual appliance is a Linux-based appliance, happens to be running VMware's version of Linux. We have a distro called Photon OS. So since that appliance is running Linux, there is an account called root, the super user account, and it's asking us here to assign a password to that account. So I'm going to type the password, I'm going to type the password again, and you need to remember whatever this password is because you're going to need to know it later on. You can optionally enable SSH, so secure remote connections to the Orchestrator server from an SSH client, or you can leave that turned off and turn it on again later. I'm going to need to go into the Orchestrator server via SSH here shortly, so I'm going to turn it on. I'll leave it to you and your security team to decide what to do here. The next two questions will make more sense later on when I've told you a bit more about how Orchestrator does what it does behind the scenes. For right now, the key word to know here is the word Kubernetes. That's going to come up again later. For our purposes right now, we can just go with these default assigned IP address ranges. We're just going to leave them alone. Next up, we need to point to our NTP server. In my environment, that's a machine at IP address 172.20.10.10. And I'm going to be using that IP address here in a couple other places because it's also my default gateway, and it is also my DNS server. And then answer the other questions, such as what's your domain name? I'm going to use that not just as my domain name, but if we ever do any short name lookups, the domain search path uses this. In my case, the same domain. And then the last thing I need to do is to specify the IP address of my Orchestrator server. As I mentioned previously, I'm going to be using a statically assigned IP address. You may have noticed already, if you read the text on the screen here, that all of these networking properties, if you leave them blank, causes VMware to use DHCP to get all these pieces of information. I intentionally want to use a statically assigned IP address. If you have the ability to use a statically assigned IP address, I would recommend you do so. Having a statically assigned IP address for a Orchestrator server or any server generally makes it easier to work with that server because you always know where it is. But if you're setting up in a home lab environment and you want to use DHCP, Orchestrator will work with that. But I'm going to use static, which means I have to plug in answers to all of these. And additionally, one last question. What's my subnet mask? Well, why don't we use 255.255.255.0? All right, as you can see, I've answered all the questions. I've gone through steps 1 through 8. If I click next, step 9 is just a summary of the answers that we've given. And now all we need to do is click the finish button. As you can see here in the vSphere client, it is beginning the process of importing the OVF file and deploying the virtual appliance for Orchestrator from that OVA file. Now, I don't suppose that you want to watch this entire process. It's not too time consuming. In my environment, which is not the fastest environment, it takes about 10 minutes or so. But again, I don't think you want to watch this whole thing, so I'm going to use some magical video editing here to speed this up. Okay, as you can see, our deployment has now completed, and we now have our machine called SA-VRO-01. That's going to be our orchestrator server, but we need to power it on. So I right-click the machine, I choose Power, Power On. Join me in the next video where I'll show you how to configure vRO.